I'm Shira Efron. I'm a researcher and director of the Climate Change and National Security Program. It's a new research program at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. As you all may be aware, our region, the Middle East and North Africa, is one of the hotspots for worsening extreme heat, drought, and sea level rise under climate change. These effects will impact international security, regional security, national security, as well as our personal security. Consensus is building that climate change exacerbates weaknesses and tensions that already exist around the world. It's associated with worsening poverty, growing socioeconomic gaps, significantly affecting migration, and risking tipping fragile countries into instability, conflict, and state failure, all challenges that our region is facing even without taking climate change into consideration. In an effort to shed a little bit of light to unpack this nexus between climate change insecurity in our region and explore, if possible, not only the challenges, but also the opportunities this nexus may bring, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the second INSS conference on this issue. Before we begin, I want to extend my deep appreciation to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Israel for their support and partnership in our research program and in this conference today. Before we begin the program and I introduce the speakers, our fabulous speakers for today, I want to welcome Dr. Alexander Brackel, head of the Foreign Office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Israel, who's joining us from Jerusalem to give brief opening remarks. Alexander, please.
Thank you very much here for the nice introduction, and thanks for all of you for joining us at whatever time of day it might be at your place. Thanks to all the distinguished speakers, and thanks to everybody who's showing an interest in watching this online event. As Shira rightly pointed out, I'm the head of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Israel. The Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, as many of you might know, it's a German political institute closely related to the Christian Democratic Union, Angela Merkel's party, and we run offices in over 100 countries all over the world. And we are always trying to strengthen the ties between the countries that we work in and Germany, based on our joint work on common values and shared problems. And today's topic is definitely a shared problem. Climate change is a worldwide phenomenon, and as Shria pointed out, apart from the environmental impact, it will have huge security repercussions that might affect all of us, and especially given that Germany is very close to the Mediterranean region that we are dealing with today. We cannot turn a blind eye to the issue, and we cannot say, oh, that's a topic that is only important for the tree huggers. It's something that goes to the core of our national interest, and therefore I'm very grateful that we got our friends and partners from the INSS on board for a long-term research program, and today's conference like one of the first outcomes of this joint program. So thank you very much to the INSS and to you, Shira. And I'm really looking forward to today's conference and all the interesting findings that we'll be presented with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, for being us today and for your partnership overall. We will now begin our panel discussion with our terrific experts. They each have very distinguished careers, so in the interest of time, I will not read their bios. I'll just mention key headlines, and we will, and you are welcome to look at their bios. I will introduce them by order of speaking. Our first speaker today is Dr. Deborah Sandler, chair of the Track 2 Environmental Forum at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. She's also a fellow with the Martin School at Oxford University. Our next speaker, who's actually with me in person, is Brigadier General Michael Herzog, who is an international fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Mike joined the Institute after a distinguished career with the IDF and also serving as Chief of Staff to the Israeli Minister of Defense. Next, we have Tessa Terpstra, joining us from Amman, Jordan. She's actually an official diplomat for Netherlands, serving as MENA Regional Envoy for Water and Energy Security. Joining us also is Rachel Omari, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, where he's a colleague of Mike. He was a Palestinian Authority official and a very senior advisor to peace negotiations between Palestinian Authority and Israel, between the PLO and Israel. We also have the pleasure of having Khalid Ben Hamou, the Managing Director of the Sahara Wind from Morocco, with us today. And last, but definitely not least, joining us is Nishad Shafi, Executive Director of the Arab Youth Climate Movement, calling from Doha, Qatar. And I see Nishad is still in the car, but soon he's going to be in front of his computer. So we will start. Debbie, let's begin with you. I want to start with a symbolic, or maybe it's not just a symbolic, you will tell us, development across the Atlantic. One of the first appointments made by President-elect Joe Biden is a former Secretary of State, John Kerry, becoming the highest-ranking U.S. official ever to have a portfolio exclusively dedicated to climate change. What does that tell us about the importance of this issue in the United States and its allies, including countries in this region, Israel and the others?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Shira. Thank you very much to INSS and to all my colleagues who are with me today. This is a very important and timely meeting, and I hope it's a building block for many more. Let me get straight to the point. As any decent lawyer would start a conversation, I have a caveat. John Kerry is well known in this region, and I'm not going to talk about him as Secretary of State. So that's my caveat. We're going to focus on him as the special presidential envoy, because I know a lot of people have a lot of history and a lot of feelings about him, but we're going to set that aside. So just for a moment, let me tell you that I don't think it's just symbolic, Shira. At least I hope it's not just symbolic. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. I'm going to start by reading you a tweet in his own words, and then we'll unpack it a little bit, okay? John Kerry tweeted on accepting the appointment, "America will soon have a government that treats the climate crisis as the urgent national security threat it is. I'm proud to partner with the president-elect, our allies, and the young leaders of the climate movement to take on this crisis as the president's climate envoy." So what's interesting about that, to unpack it, is that he is now a member of the National Security Council. He's not part of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Security Council. It's a cabinet which focuses on national security and foreign policy. It's the president's advisors and his cabinet officials. So why is John Kerry in the NSC? Well, because it's been increasingly recognized over many decades and by military and strategic plans in the US that pursuing and maintaining security objectives in the face of acute environmental stress requires much more than defensive coercive measures, even in a hostile environment. So that's their take, and already you can see where it's going to our situation. This is building on a military and a strategic approach towards climate change in the US, in Europe, and in other Western countries. In 2007, the US Military Advisory Board stated that the nature of climate change poses a grave threat to US national security. In 2014, the Pentagon Adaptation Roadmap was committed to integrating climate change threats in all of its plans, operations, and training across the entire Defense Department. So why Kerry? I'm Secretary of State to climate. He's a senior diplomat. He's very visible, which is what Biden wanted. And he was an architect of the Paris Agreement. And in 2019, he launched something called World War Zero, which brought unlikely allies together for net zero emissions by 2050. So what's the job? What does this reflect that we've got this person in place? His primary job is to reestablish and extend US leadership in this area. Now, that sounds easy. He can rejoin the Paris Agreement, which we all know he can do. All Biden has to do is write a letter to the UN Secretary General, and he's back in. But it's actually not so easy. He's got to rebuild trust and credibility. After 4 years of denial of science, denial of COVID, denial of climate change, rollback of administrative and environmental regulations, and he left 200 countries standing, including Israel, 6 months on the Paris Agreement alone after the US pulled out. So how does he do that? Well, he's going on, I believe, we don't know, but I believe he's going to go on several approaches. One is he has to prove the United States as a model by accelerating infrastructure and emissions regulations at home. And on the other hand, he's got to offer support to nations abroad who are both mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. And he's doing that while he's fighting, he may be fighting a divided Congress. We'll know more about that in January.
Right.
And finally, I want to just say that he has promised that within the first 100 days of his campaign, of his administration, to pull together a climate summit conference. So at that point, we'll really see what he's all about. So that is it in a nutshell.
No, this is great. It's really helpful. And as you noted, it's not going to be easy domestically in the US, more than internationally so. But after you explain briefly what's happening now on that side of the Atlantic, can you give us, before we dive into it, how the effects of climate change, really, if you can just give in our region, the Middle East, what climate change, what placing climate change at that level of importance by the US, and if Kerry succeed at leading the international community in that direction, what will it mean for our region, for Israel and countries in this region?
Okay, so first of all, let me say that you've already said something unusual, which is that you're asking about a regional perspective, because usually whenever climate change is discussed in Israel, it's always from a national perspective, and it's understandable why. But it's a very essential and neglected aspect which impacts on everything we do. I believe it's, I'll say just one more thing about that. I think it's fanciful. I don't know what's going to happen in the rest of this discussion, but I think it's fanciful to talk about climate change only from a national perspective. You have to include the region. If climate change doesn't stop at borders. So everyone knows this is one of the most volatile regions in the world. Not everybody listening may understand exactly how dangerous it is from an environmental point of view and how the two intertwine. So typically when you're looking at what makes a region a hotspot, which the Middle East is, one of the worst hotspots on the planet, you look at three components. You look at rising temperatures, precipitation, and sea change. We have to understand that to understand what the US can do. And I think that what you're asking me is what is our situation? And Mike's going to go into a little bit about how does that affect Israel strategically. And in our region, the extreme weather, the extreme temperatures will make living impossible as we know it. It's all the models show thing. It used to be 40 degrees was for habitation. Now they pushed it back to 50, and this past year we've had over 54 down in the desert. That leads to hypothermia, illness, drought, fires, crop failures. NASA reported that the Middle East drought from 1998 to 2012 was the worst in 900 years. And by 2050, there'll be a 30% decline in agriculture. And by 2050, the Gulf states will have 50 degrees as common. So what does this mean for us? I'm going to just give you two examples. Syria. Many people know, many people don't know, that it was historic droughts in eastern Syria that caused 85% of the cattle to die, mass years of crop failure, causing people to move into the cities, no employment. That in turn caused civil unrest, which eventually led to civil war. It's created the most dire humanitarian crisis. It precipitated the most dire humanitarian crisis we've had in the 21st century so far, and the largest source of refugees. The second example of another neighbor that I want to bring up is Gaza. Israel shares its rivers, its aquifers, its air, its coastline with its Palestinian neighbors. And due to lack of energy, There's no full functioning power stations in Gaza. As a result, millions of gallons, last I read, 29 million gallons of sewage are dumped into the Mediterranean every day, swept by currents to Ashkelon, which causes fouling and occasional closing of one of Israel's largest desal plants. I think Mike or someone might be talking about what happens with COVID, but they have 33% in Gaza right now. It's a non-airborne disease, but only 97% of the water in Gaza is fit for drinking. You can imagine what's going to happen if disease breaks out, your hypothermia, lack of food, but will go just a few miles up the border. So I'm going to just conclude this by talking about what the challenges here, rather than giving you solutions at this point. I'm waiting to my point to later down. The National Academy of Sciences has said that there is a shift in temperature over the next 50 years that is going to be more dramatic than the past 6,000 years of history combined. That's been collaborated by an Israeli scientist, Ori Shanas, who stated, quote, "If we look at future predictions, all of Israel will become a desert by the end of the century. Temperatures in the Galilee will be the same as in the Negev." So it's not a happy picture that I'm painting. And going back to your question, it's a picture that we are in general ignoring, which is why I, for one, am very grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you, Debbie, very much. We'll go back to you later because it is interesting. You clearly describe a dire situation, and I agree with you that there's not enough action to mitigate these effects. The question is also, but if there is international leadership on this issue, is there any hope? But we'll get to it in the second round. I want to turn to Mike, who is sitting next to me, and just before we get into this, continuing the scenarios that Debbie got into, you really, I wish I could read it now, we don't have time, but you've really had a distinguished career in the IDF, in the defense establishment. As someone who's been reading the stuff that you've been writing, even in think tanks afterwards, you always deal with core defense issues, capabilities. What made you shift your recent focus to climate?
Well, as you know, I served in the IDF for several decades, for many, many years. And in the course of my service, I was close to decision-making processes in terms of national security. I was head of the IDF's strategic planning division. I worked very closely with 4 ministers of defense. I served on 2 committees which dealt with Israel's national security doctrine. And throughout the years, my thinking on these issues of national security and thinking of all my colleagues in the IDF was a traditional way of thinking, looking at it in terms of hard power, military capabilities, diplomacy, and sometimes we added the economy, education, and so on. We never thought about it in terms of the impact of environmental change, climate change on national security, and that's the way I grew up to think about it, and all my colleagues. Just over a year ago, I received an invitation to go to Oxford, to the Martin School in Oxford, which you mentioned, to participate in a 3-day workshop on climate change in our region. I was invited by Dennis Ross. I believe it was Debbie's invitation through him. And I went there. I did not know what to expect, but after 3 days of discussing, and there were Israelis, Palestinians, there were Americans, there were Europeans there, and so on, it dawned on me that there is a big issue here, which is part of our national security. Climate change must be considered now an issue of national security. We have in our region, on the one hand, this region is highly vulnerable, highly unstable in geopolitical terms, and if you add on top of it the fact that it is a hotspot in terms of climate change, so this creates a danger multiplier which will necessarily impact our national security. And my conclusion was that the first thing to be done is to raise awareness that there is a big issue, emerging issue that has to be treated and has to be integrated into our thinking about our national security doctrine. And my second conclusion was that since this challenge knows no borders, it's a faceless enemy that knows no borders, we might not be able to just build walls and insulate ourselves. We will have to develop a regional concept like Debbie mentioned and develop cooperation regionally to deal with these issues.
Thank you. No, that's really fascinating, making this shift. I want to ask you if you could give us specific examples of where do you see this, threat multiplier, mention, the security implications in the case of Israel and where it actually meets the hard security issues that you're so used to dealing with. And if I could just add another question on this, you spoke about your years in service where you haven't tackled this issue, but do you think, based on your contacts with people in the defense establishment in Israel, that now the defense establishment and national security is treating it seriously?
Okay, let's take your questions one by
one.
So first I would like to say, as I mentioned, this region we live in is highly unstable in geopolitical terms. It is characterized by instability, by chronic instability, by failed and failing states, by the weakness of state structure, by the relative strength of non-state or sub-state actors. And if you add to this mix the climate change element, I think it will necessarily increase instability in our region. Now, it could impact some countries which are an anchor of stability in our thinking about our national security, like Egypt and Jordan, our neighbors with whom we have peace agreements. We have a vested interest in their stability because their stability is also part of our national security and our stability. Specifically Jordan, if Jordan collapses for some reason, I think it would have dire consequences for the state of Israel. And it's no coincidence that for decades, even before we signed the peace agreement, Israel had invested in Jordan's stability, including when they had war with the Syrians and in many other cases. And if these countries are destabilized, then perhaps non-state hostile actors might take over or fill the void, and which definitely would have a negative impact on us. Take the Palestinians for instance. While we have a political conflict, an unresolved conflict with the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority, notwithstanding that, I think Israel has an interest in the stability, in the continued existence and stability of the Palestinian Authority, because if it collapses on us, and we bear a lot of the consequences. Now, we just had a wake-up call by COVID-19. The impact of COVID-19 on the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza definitely impacts Israel as well. If they collapse because of that, if they are incapable to treat their own population, it all projects on us. That's why when this crisis broke out, Israel went out of its way to provide assistance, to facilitate medical treatment. We even hosted medical groups from Gaza for training and so on and so forth. So now think about it in terms of climate change. If you have an extreme situation of climate change that impacts either the West Bank or Gaza, Israel just cannot insulate itself. Debbie mentioned sewage flowing from Gaza. Occasionally shutting down desalination plants in the Mediterranean, I think it's a very good example, and we have many other examples as well. On top of that, climate change could severely exacerbate the problem of refugees in our area. It was mentioned what happened in the Syrian war. Syrian war created the biggest refugee problem since World War II. But if you have a refugee problem born out of extreme situation of climate change, it could definitely impact us. We in Israel experienced a wave of refugees coming from Africa through Egypt, and we had to stop it by building a fence, a border fence, like 7 years ago. Now imagine, I don't know how many people marching on our borders because the areas they live in become uninhabitable. I don't think that we can forever just build walls and fences and insulate ourselves. It will definitely have create a major problem for us. If you look at the war in Syria, it created millions of refugees in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in turn in Europe itself. So I think this in a nutshell gives you a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there are models that show the situation in Egypt by 2030. So it's not, 100 years down the line, it's 10 years from now, could lead to just as large a crisis or even larger given the scale and how much bigger Egypt is. But if you can just really briefly address my third question, if you remember, it was more like, okay, what does Israel do to grapple with this issue?
Well, I think we have a very long way to go because I don't think there is awareness in the defense establishment about this problem. I'm in touch with many people in our defense establishment. They don't think in these terms. They are unaware. I think awareness is very, very slowly and gradually developing, and we have to do much more, including such conferences as this. I think we have to get to a point where people from the defense establishment and environmentalists sit together on the same table and discuss these issues. And ultimately, you have to find some people who will kind of bite and become engines and push this agenda forward until the day that our decision makers understand that this is a big issue. So we have to create a momentum which will be both bottom up and top down.
Thank you, Mike, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Tessa, I would like to turn to you. You have a really unique position as MENA Regional Envoy for Climate and Water Security. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, Alexander did mention it in his opening remarks, but why the Netherlands, Western, you could say Northern Western European countries, that concerned with these issues in faraway Middle East, that it has such a role?
Yes, thank you very much, Shira, and thank you so much for this really interesting conversation already. And it's I fully agree, it's spot on. In fact, I received sorry, I have a fly here. I received some comments from my colleagues back in the Netherlands, like, oh, super that you're doing this on this very, very important topic. So why do we do this? Well, because we're all equally concerned about climate change and the future of our kids, and even more, you're simply our neighbors. We regard this part of the world as the southern part of Europe as our neighborhood, and the future challenges that we see here in the region with climate change are challenges as well. And the former speakers alluded to this already. Climate change doesn't have any borders, and the Syria crisis has shown us that the effects of climate change, of drought, can be humongous, and in terms of displacement of people. And we've seen the ripple effects in 2015 in Europe of these challenges. And if you look at, for instance, the news website, the New Humanitarian, over the past couple of years, I've noticed that of every 10 news items per week, 3 in the top 3 are all related to climate. So we see this as a growing a growing concern. And living in Jordan over the past 4 years, it's become very clear that as we speak about climate change in the Netherlands as something of the future, mentioning years as 2030 or 2050 or the end of the century, here in the region, we are living climate change today. It's something that's very, very clear daily. Looking at water availability, drinking water availability in Jordan, for instance, and the emergency that the government of Jordan has to announce every summer because they need to keep on providing the population with drinking water, just to mention a few. And as the former speakers have already said, the temperature prospects for this region are really, really alarming. And one of the statistics that I find specifically daunting is that the prognosis is that the hottest days now will be the coolest by the end of the century. And just let that sink in. That is amazing. And the first speaker talked about the inhabitability of the region if we can indeed continue on this track with a temperature rise here in North Africa and the Middle East twice as high as elsewhere in the world. So these are the reasons why, and the ripple effects it has on our communities, both here in the region, obviously, where the absorption capacity of displaced is so much higher, or has to be higher than in Europe. Still in Europe, we do see the consequences of this, and indeed it's something that we share with you, a concern for the future.
Thank you. And I was just imagining the heat that we will have to cope with.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it means? What are your main activities? How they intersect with regional actors, and how successful you are as a neighbor, but still an external player, external actor in this region, how you are able to promote regional cooperation that, as we heard before, without which we can't move forward on this issue.
Well, that's a whole mouthful. I'll try to unpack that a little bit, because indeed I am an outsider. I'm an outsider with a big heart for the region, I must say. I've been living here in Jordan, as I said, for more than 5 years. More than 4 years, and living in Egypt for more than 5. So I travel in the region extensively to the West Bank and Gaza, and of course Israel, Lebanon, and Egypt a lot. Next to Jordan as well, with big pleasure. I love being here. So what do we do? Well, in the Netherlands, we have a long tradition of what we call the so-called Dutch diamond. And this is working together with government, civil society, private sector, and academia. So with these different sectors of society, I and the teams I work with try to work on mitigating climate change and building resilience for future climate shocks. And we do this by focusing mostly on the 3 components that are so closely interlinked, and that we'll talk about a bit more later on, which is the way that we produce our food by recycling water and by using renewable energy wherever we can, trying to become resilient in the way that we use our natural resources. And I say we, I mean our partners here in the region that we try to work with, to help them arrive at this efficiency. And as you know, the Dutch, or well, maybe you don't know, but the Dutch have sort of had water productivity more or less go through the roof in terms of the really substantially reducing the amount of water used for a kilo of tomatoes. For instance, here in Jordan, they would use typically 60 liters of water for 1 kilo of tomatoes, and in the Netherlands that would be 3 liters of water for 1 kilo of tomatoes, and that's in a water-rich country such as the Netherlands. But we do suffer drought ourselves, start suffering droughts ourselves. So we've really managed to make this production more efficiently. And one of the key elements I would like to mention here in our working with the region on these water, energy, and food efficiency is that the human rights-based approach for us is extremely important, and meaning a fair and equal access to and distribution of natural resources. And this is, together with the technology, this principle is very, very important for us. And it also means access to knowledge on how to use resources sustainably. So this is whether it's access to water for small farmers in Jordan, or land reform in Egypt, trying to help the government to look at land reform, or access to energy in Gaza. So these are some of the issues I work on, and we have our embassies with their country programs, looking at optimizing food production, using less water, less energy, and we also do this on a regional level. So we've just launched a challenge for the region for entrepreneurs working on water and energy efficient food production. They can win a challenge and be supported to increase their market share, to boost their business. We work on this with 9 countries in the region. Another example is a regional training center for water recycling that we have established here in Jordan, to bring together water professionals from different countries around the region to look at water recycling and reuse in agriculture. So these are some of the issues that we do. So I focus mostly on Jordan, Gaza, and the West Bank, Egypt, and Lebanon, and working with the partners in the region, like UNESCO, the League of Arab States, governments, obviously, the EU, multilateral development banks, and private sector, regional think tanks, etc. So this is all a whole mix of partners that we work with.
Thank you, and we'll get to it in a moment, but of course when you put in Lebanon in a list of countries, that makes it really interesting how you combine also discussions with Israel on some of these issues. So maybe we'll get back to the challenges that you encounter in promoting these types of regional cooperation next.
Sure.
Next to Raif Al-Omari. Just before we get into Palestinian issues, which you're having the Palestinian hat on, you are also a Jordan expert, a Jordan national, if I'm not mistaken. And Mike spoke about Jordan. Tessa is obviously based in Jordan. To what extent do you know, in your analysis, does climate issues, water shortages, do these issues factor into national security agenda? I guess within the king's circles and with the Jordanian government, and how does it affect their calculations in terms of regional cooperation?
Thanks, Shira, first of all, and thank you for the INSS, and I'm really honored and humbled to be with such a distinguished group of experts. But look, first of all, with Jordan, let me start with saying maybe it matters that the king himself actually pays attention to the issue of environment. If you look at his international messaging, you look at his UN General Assembly speeches, in multilateral meetings, environmental issues always always are a constant theme, and that matters because it sends an important signal, keeps it on the agenda. However, this doesn't always translate into actual structural structural action. we see in general the issues of environment in Jordan are relegated to the Ministry of Environment, which is really a second or third tier ministry, and this reflects on terms of budget, staffing, etc. To understand how it figures in the national security discussion, we have to look at how the national security discussion in Jordan is structured. First of all, Jordan has no national security doctrine, no actually written national security doctrine. And this Jordan is not unique. I mean, Israel doesn't have one. I'm not aware of any Arab country that has it. More importantly, Jordan has no national security council process. I mean, unlike the US, unlike Israel, there isn't an interagency process to feed some of these ideas in. And it remains, like what Mike described, the domain of the hard security folks, military, intelligence, etc. Now, some issues, though, do go up to the level of national security or perceived as national security threats. Here, two issues stand out. One is water and one is energy. Because these have a direct, concrete effect, tangible effect on Jordan's stability. Now, this impacts the second part of your question, which is how it affects regional cooperation. And here I'm going to focus on Israel. And again, we have to zoom out and look at the nature of the Jordan-Israel relation today. It's no secret that it's an extremely negative moment and has been for a while in the relation between the two countries. And that's for two reasons. One, in Jordan itself, any cooperation with Israel is very unpopular. Anti-normalization is extremely strong in Jordan, and any cooperation comes with a heavy political price. Second, the relation at the very top, between the king and Prime Minister Netanyahu, is one that's characterized by basic mistrust. I mean, and we can go for a long time about, why this mistrust is there, but the fact is it's there. What this means is that cooperation between the two countries only happens on issues that they both define as core national security threats or interests. So, and these become shielded from these dynamics that I described. So you look at where the two countries are collaborating. They're collaborating on, obviously, hard security. And as Mike mentioned, this even precedes the peace agreement. But also they cooperate on these two issues that I mentioned, on water. Since the signing of the peace agreement, actually, Israel has been providing Jordan more than the allotted share in the agreement, and more recently on energy. And what we saw was fascinating in that Jordan decided to pay the political price of signing a gas deal with Israel once natural gas was discovered, offshore gas was discovered in Israel. Jordan was willing to pay the political price because it defined it as a national security issue. Unfortunately, the issue of climate change, since it has not risen in the Jordanian national security thinking, yet to the level of a national security issue, does not constitute an issue that relates to or that's seen as meriting cooperation between the two sides. And my sense is on Israel, it's the same sense. When you see Israelis and Jordanians meeting to discuss what are the core issues that they're willing to push through their own complex political systems, this never rises up. And that's why it's key that we define issues of climate change as national security issues, because this is how you give them priority and you protect them from politicization and from the vagaries of political relations.
Thank you, Ray. That's really helpful. And it seems like it's something that has to happen on both sides of the river. Let's go sort of west to the West Bank. You've been involved in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations on final status issues for a long time, including on water. And as we know, there are no negotiations now. We spoke about the low and lack of trust between Jordan and Israel. It just can be, I think, the situation between Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu is probably even worse than the one you described between Jordan and Israel. Previous agreements, even on environmental issues, are not being implemented. Under these circumstances, what can Israel and Palestinians realistically achieve on this environmental cooperation? And we can separate maybe like short-term and longer-term, because Mike mentioned COVID-19 cooperation, and I think that's a really good examples of what can happen, but it's still different, right? There's a crisis, the pandemic is the discrete event. We bring in, test kits, we bring in PPE, maybe ventilators, and this is what we're able to do. But I think on the issues of environment and climate, you need something that's much more sustained and long-term. So what's the horizon for that under the current political circumstances?
Right, in very short, it's very grim. Look, first of all, I mean, I think the fact that there is no negotiations, for our purposes at least today, is not a bad thing. I mean, what we've often seen when you have high political negotiations, issues like environment, even water, and things of this sort, become relegated to a secondary status and often actually become political chips. I mean, I remember during the Camp David negotiations, the instructions that we gave to the water team, to the environment team, etc., is don't move. Let the big boys, and unfortunately they were all boys, deal with the big issues, borders, security, etc. And these other issues are chips in this big game. So sometimes the lack of political negotiations actually creates space for movement on these more concrete issues. That's one. Two, this is Palestine, Israel, where unfortunately everything is politicized, and we've seen it recently. You know, even core issues like security cooperation, like financial relations, become politicized when there's only so far that you can do to shield things from politicization. That said, we do see areas where you have cooperation, and unfortunately, though, these fall in very limited categories. One, which you alluded to earlier, is when something becomes a big problem. COVID, Gaza water, we have smaller examples, for example, waste treatment in the Ramallah, Beira area, things of this sort. But these really rise to the level of priority when they become a pressing problem. Until that, they become ignored and politicized like everything else. And the other area of cooperation is when you have, targets of opportunity. When you have specific moments where the stars align. For example, in Gaza now, we see some cases where, local actors, municipal level in Gaza and NGO level in Israel, who found ways of cooperating in issues of water purification, etc., and have moved in that direction. But by and large, these are all very ad hoc. Today, as I see it, if the impetus is only coming from the Palestinians and the Israelis, I see absolutely no chance for institutionalizing this kind of cooperation. It will have to remain ad hoc and it remains politicized. Now, this raises an important point actually for the incoming US administration. And it remains to be seen. Look, if they decide, like everyone else, to engage in a high-level, ultimately failed diplomatic process, then we can kiss all of this goodbye. Any chance of cooperation. If, on the other hand, they start focusing on specific issues and tell the Palestinians and the Israelis that on these issues, economy, security, environment, etc., these are American priorities and we expect you to behave, I think we can move forward. And here we have examples of how this worked in the past, security cooperation being the kind of, and the American role being the kind of poster child, but there are other issues. One last, small but important point is I've been talking here about official cooperation. There is another area which I see as much more vibrant is the informal, people-to-people NGO cooperation. This is where the real energy is happening. And for this, though, we do need the governments to play a certain role, at least the role of do no harm. On the Palestinian side, we see a very strong anti-normalization move, often encouraged and condoned by the very top. And on the Israeli side, we see a movement to delegitimize any cooperative relations. And I hope that the international community, and obviously the US, will come and at least provide the space. I don't want, maybe it's a bridge too far to ask the governments to invest in these people-to-people issues at this moment, at least make them do no harm and let these very courageous individuals and groups actually cooperate, because a lot of the cutting edge of what we see is happening on that level, not on the governmental level.
Thank you, Raith. Appreciate you being also a little bit optimistic on that, and it's a good segue to our next speaker, Khalid. When you're representing both NGOs but also private sector, so it's interesting. We spoke primarily about the Levant region, but North Africa is also extremely vulnerable to climate change. We spoke about Egypt, but obviously Morocco is also in a precarious situation. Can you share with us sort of the key challenges that Morocco faces on this issue?
Well, before I address this issue, I'd like first of all to reiterate, because I participate as a private person to this meeting, Morocco's official position on the resumption of the negotiation process between Palestinians and Israelis for a viable Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as capital. This is the official position and is strongly backed by popular support. So that being said, I also want to address the issue of climate change and security. It's a very big issue that lawmakers have been aware of for some time. I mean, John Kerry, Joe Biden, Richard Lugar, when they were at the Foreign Relations Committee, were perfectly aware that these were the defining issues of the time. And they have actually provided support to an initiative that I was launching, namely Sahara Wind and building capacity on hydrogen technology. And you can see now the whole thing unfolding. And they've managed to pull support from NATO. And that's to show you when you have a military strategic partnership pulling its resources into environmental and energy security issues, that many things can be projected into the future. Also want to mention the role of lawmakers in Germany that have pushed for feed-in tariffs, enabling renewable energies to be rolled out. That's important. Energy and energy-related issues, 75% of the carbon emissions. So it's a tremendous issue, and that's why it's important that we can use this to mobilize countries across the region to tackle the defining challenge of our time. When you look at obviously climate change in our region, we're as much as affected as you are. Morocco is witnessing its second year of consecutive drought. We have 35% filling capacity in our water dam, dropping from 45% last year at the same time. And the loss of biodiversity, desertification, land degradation. I let you imagine what the consequences are for our agriculture as well. The challenge is obviously to make it more resilient, and we have seen how agri-technologies from Israel has helped through the 70s, in fact, Morocco's agriculture to become more resilient and competitive. And again, the key to the water challenge in Morocco, we've had initially the plan of moving water from the north of Morocco into the south. Now, thanks to desalination technologies, and in particular to renewable energy becoming more and more affordable, the combination of renewables and desalination enables some interesting combinations to be made, namely to scale up the desalination plants and supply cities at the same time as agricultural basins, where through public-private partnerships, you can provide water to farmers at 0.5 euro per cubic meter and enable an economy, which is Morocco's largest economy, its agriculture, to survive during these dire times.
Thank you. I was actually really pleased to read that Morocco is actually the leading country on climate change in Africa, that on different indices it's doing pretty well, and it's primarily thanks to solar energy developments, which is also, I know, your area in renewables. Can you tell us a little bit about Morocco's solar strategy and what it could mean for the region at large and Europe that you just mentioned?
Yeah, well, Morocco, because of the scale of its wind resource on the Sahara coastline and its solar resource overall, its proximity to Europe as an energy market. Now we're talking also not only electrons, but molecules, green molecules. So Morocco has started a very balanced portfolio of renewable energies, split between solar and wind capacities, with hydro capacity being already maxed out. So we're talking about pumping hydro for storing intermittent renewables. So the target of Morocco was 42% renewables by 2020 and 52% by 2030. It seems that this target of 2030 will be achieved by 2026, and we're now looking at a higher target. wind, because of the trade winds, is the most promising sector. We've got 70% capacity factor on the Sahara trade wind blown coastline. One of the lowest production costs, 3 cents per kilowatt hour already in 2016. And we've managed to transfer manufacturing industries, wind turbine manufacturing industries. We've got a blade factory, Siemens with 700 jobs, 80% dedicated to export in a globalized renewable energy supply chain. We've got now most recently China that has come up with the plant doubling this capacity for also its globalized supply chain. So you can see now hubs of renewables and manufacturing. But what is most interesting in the Moroccan case is that Morocco disposes of about 75% of the world phosphate reserves. It's critical for world food security as it is used for fertilizer. But because of that business, Morocco's OCP group, it's a state conglomerate handling the phosphate business, the fertilizer business, is the largest importer of ammonia, which is gray ammonia at this stage. And it has the possibility to shift into green ammonia. Only that shift of the 2 million ton it currently imports would enable the deployment of about 8 gigawatts of wind. And if you deploy that scale of renewable capacities, not only will you reinforce the desalination prospect and the sustainable agriculture possibilities of the country, but you would also then provide exports for what is likely going to be a new energy carrier, which is green hydrogen, green ammonia, and also the regional integration of North Africa with Europe, and obviously North Africa with sub-Saharan Africa. You have, for example, we have been active through NATO as well, with support of NATO in supporting Mauritanian universities in harnessing the wind energy so that they can also process the iron ore, and they can process it into CO2 emission-free steel. And you generate the value locally, just like Morocco does with the phosphate and its fertilizer. And with that, you can scale up tremendously the wind portfolio, you can stabilize the grids, and you can also supply very large amounts of wind, very low cost wind and solar electricity to sub-Saharan Africa. So you got some interesting leads for regional integration on clean energy networks that will arise in the region. And of course, these need to be supported many years ahead, because that's how a country can set up a strategy. And I would wish that in your region, you would be able to project similar case scenarios with the resources that you have in the Middle East.
Inshallah. No, but I think it's really important that you mentioned, and we don't have time to get into this in this conference, but you brought up not just the nexus between, you know, national security and climate that we're talking about. You actually mentioned the nexus between energy and food security and water. You spoke about job creation. These are really, really big topics, and it's a lot of opportunities, not just the challenges. We're talking about the solutions here. Speaking about solutions, I want to switch to Nishad, who's joining us from Doha. You know, before we get into your role with representing the Arab Youth Climate Movement, you live and work in Qatar. What is Qatar's perception of climate change? How does it factor into Qatar's national security consideration, especially given it's an understatement, tense ties with the other Gulf Cooperation Council countries? We're talking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I know there are negotiations now with the hope of repairing these ties, but how is Qatar thinking about this?
Well, update regarding Saudi, there was some reconciliation yesterday, and hopefully the airspace will be open very soon. That's the news we're having here.
Yeah.
Towards the Qatar National Day coming up very early in December 18. So this should be some good news. So, well, to start with, I will go back to Deborah's comments from how John Kerry mentioned in his tweet immediately after taking the special envoy role, is that I'm proud to partner with President, our allies, and young youth movement. So that's where we come from. We are the young people who have to perceive and live in the world which we are now talking about, which is not going to be looking great. So coming back to the reality of Qatar, Qatar is also almost the Gulf countries, which is part of the Middle East as a larger area. And like you mentioned, This region also has almost everything what Khalid was mentioning in terms of climate impacts. But of how it is perceived from community perspective, it's very low. And my experience in last 5 years in climate movement is that our region is known for different issues, like what you're mentioning now, security issues and war and system. And like how Gate mentioned, climate and environment is the top of the agenda of any conversation, bottom of the agenda. You sit out with any of the ministries, say, Nishad, come later. This is not on our agenda today. So this is the issue which we are facing it. But at the government level, the conversation happens with UN agencies, their commitment with Paris Agreement are all happening at a very high level where people are in the understanding the reality. I mean, they feel that they're disconnected from what the government is talking about. And that's where young people coming into picture and showcasing why climate change is a real emergency situation in the Middle East. Because when a climate issues happen, and immediately the figure comes into their mind is a forest fire in California or flooding in Bangladesh. I mean, they're not seeing the fact their own region is slipping into the bottom. The sea level rise is happening here. And the extreme heat wave would be super norm in the days to come. And, ACs may be saving us, but the utilities and infrastructure strains which are going to happen in the coming days would be quite enormous. So that's the image of climate change in our region, Perspective from people are key low. And the whole the media showcase of westernized climate impact is what they see on everyday news, including all the regional news channels too. So the impacts of climate change is very visible in Qatar too. Desertification is getting quite hard, and the government is working from their perspective to mitigate the CO2 emissions. As it's a gas and oil-based country, so local consumption is quite low in terms of what we can see. Much of the junk goes from the export of natural gas and oil. So the larger extent of understanding is that people are far disconnected from the realities of climate change happening in our own country than elsewhere. So that's the role we as FICM, Arab Youth Climate, does here.
So that's great. So the Arab Youth Climate Movement, which is great that this organization exists, and we all talk about what future we live for our children, but it's also in large part will depend on what the youth does today. So where are Arab youth on this topic, and how do you see Arab public opinion shifting, and what could it mean for policy changes?
Well, Arab Youth Climate have been formed exclusively for this idea, what even of the colleagues were mentioning. There's a lack of awareness, and that can be only brought up by community-led movements or organizations. Like Gate and others mentioned, community has a key role here. Government to government things are not happening at this point of time. Now it is up to the community and young leaders in the region to come forward. I mean, we celebrate Greta Thunberg and others in the Europe. Where is our Greta Thunberg? I don't know, we don't need a Greta Thunberg. Where are our young leaders in terms of climate action? Where is our young leaders asking our leaders for climate action, how solutions they need? Like Tessa mentioned, I just wanted to be very proudly say, when I was driving back, actually I was coming from the Dutch embassy. We were meeting the Dutch ambassador for a program on cycling and healthy living in Qatar. So what we do is to bring that perspective. Middle East is hot, but we have 6 months of temperature below 20 degrees. Why can't we use a cycle? We are a car-driven country. How can we change that lifestyle mentality of our young people? Because we know we have to have a better future, and we know we blame all the things on the elders and the seniors who lived, but we also have our own responsibility of changing the way we live our life now. So that was a program I just wanted to mention. So we just came from embassy. That is known for cycling. And we are coming out with a program which develop cycling tracks are coming up overwhelming in number in Qatar, but they are disconnected. I have to take my cycle in my car to take a cycling track, but it is not cycling roads, like how you have in Dutch or Netherlands. So these are programs we're working, and we're working on individual carbon footprint calculators, which we developed as our organization in support of UNESCO office here in Doha. The idea is to build a citizenship movement. Okay, we know government has whatever limitations they have to do, but the ground reality is if we doesn't know what is exactly happening, we are not going to achieve what we really need to. And yes, the region has a lot of young people. Of course, they're moving to a position to a decision makers have been now sitting too. When you educate that level of young people, definitely when they are sitting into that position of an undersecretary or minister special envoy, they would definitely change their perception. And thanks to COVID, a lot of people were sitting idle in the comfort of ACs in our part of the region. To be frank, we were blessed to have all the safety and security here. People started observing nature, and they were saying, wow, even our countries have a quite enormous wealth of biodiversity, even though it is limited to a desert ecosystem. I said, that was there for ever since this country was born. You didn't have the time to check because you fly all the time to Europe, or Africa to enjoy your beauty. Your natural beauty of a desert ecosystem itself is an ecosystem of its own beauty. People started going to the desert, going to the caves here. They started exploring own country. So natural wonder they had. They realized this is new, not knowing that this was there for a long time. That was actually one of our programs we pushed before COVID, is that bringing back to nature program, where we wanted to take people to some of the niche places in Qatar, like the mangroves, some of the mountains in the desert, and there is a lagoon inside of one of the desert here. People are least interested. Now they were asking, Nishad, can we kickstart those programs, see how the mentality is changing? So the situation calls for that change, but this is not easy because we will not have COVID things, when we don't want to have that sort of things in the coming days. We want people to think on that and bring that change. And that's exactly what FICM does, and we're trying to do is, and also lately we are also now working with policy. We just had a call with Ministry of Public Health to work to see what is the climate change impact on migrant workers. So, much of the Gulf countries have a lot of migrant workers here, and how heat wave in the coming days would have a great impact on their health. So these are some of the programs we're engaging with, not only with the young and youth community, but also at large, engaging in dialogue with the government. We're also proud to be part with our constant conversation with the ministry to have youth in their upcoming NDCs, one of the few Gulf countries to have youth perspective on their NDCs. I would not thank us, but thanks to the government for inviting us to have a seat in this discussions. It is quite important to find our say in the government policies. So yeah, this is what we do.
Thank you, Nishad. We'll go back to you in a second. We are going to take, I have lots more questions, but I'll just do a really quick round, and you please feel free to relate and respond to what others have said, but just briefly. Debbie, I want to go back to you. You've worked for decades on regional cooperation before this was even a buzz term. Can you share with us really briefly, like 3 key takeaways and lessons, what works, what doesn't work, especially where the political circumstances are not right for that?
Sure. Okay. So I want to do it in a way that brings what other people have said into my thinking. First of all, I think in a region like ours, the first thing that goes through all 3 themes would be humility. I know it's almost counterintuitive to say a thing like that in the Middle East, but unless there's humility and there's a willingness to listen, to really listen, to be secure enough in your own position, no matter what I say, and no matter what any of us say, is going to fail. It's going to fail. So why do we need humility? We need humility to build trust. And here comes my 3 takeaways that you had asked me to think about. My first takeaway is cooperative partnership. And I'm saying this is very important because nobody in the region is talking. So I'm trying to be as relevant as possible. If we had governments talking, I might say different things. We need needs-based, reliable, manageable, proactive partnership. So in addition to being a fellow at Oxford, I'm chair of the Track 2 Environmental Forum, which covers Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. And I want to just say a second that it's a very unique initiative. And Nishad, I'm so excited to meet you because one of our initiatives is a regional network of young professional leaders who are in fantastic positions in countries all over our region, who speak once a week, once a month, with climate change being their main focus for shifting normative views, what they feel and what they think. And I would love, this is a great forum that we can make a connection. So that's the first thing, is that we have over the last 4 years on the ground, we're the ones responsible for those projects that Raith was talking about in Gaza. And through full partnership, we meet every week with Palestinians, Jordanians, Israelis at very high levels. And we're dealing with scientists, academics. It's almost like a little bit of a Dutch diamond, but no government, because government isn't interested. And the idea is to establish projects on the ground in partnership that really make a difference and build trust rather than just talk. You don't hear about us because of safety reasons, so we've had to keep under the radar. Now, Raith also said, but projects can be quite random, can't they? And that's true, which is why the second takeaway is something that I like to call strategic sensibility. So if you're going to work in a region like ours, you not only need full partnership based on humility, but you need practical sense, working with science, pragmatics, and politics together. And for that reason, we've partnered with Oxford University, which is where Mike came into this whole situation. We need to make sure what happens on the ground is not random. Oxford, in support of what's happening on the ground, has just given £1 million to support all of these efforts. And we have a huge network of academics, experts, and politicians from outside the region. And you need to have strategy to help what's happening on the ground. My third takeaway is what Mike said earlier, which is it can never be top down in a region like this, and it can never be bottom up. So we have a top down, bottom up trickle effect where we partner with current foreign ministers who believe the way we do. We've got the youth. There's a regional network for youth. And it's not just us, but the idea is these are the three things you need. You need real action to make things happen. And the reason Mike and Rafe were invited to Oxford is because the top-down level is we need the experience of diplomats, of negotiators, and people who have worked at that level, but we also need the experience and understanding of people like Nishad, especially when governments aren't talking to each other. So that very briefly, those are my three takeaways of how we go forward in our current situation. And something like you're doing right here, Shira, gives a forum and a platform, and as you've seen, an opportunity for us to take it another step in the right direction.
Thank you, Debbie. Much appreciated. I want to take one of your points and bring it to Mike and to Rafe, maybe the same question, because you said governments are not talking, but does the development that some people see as controversial, I personally think it's a really good development of governments that are talking. Israel has normalized ties with a few countries in the region. There are efforts ongoing. And if you've read the annexes of the Abraham Accords, you notice that there's a section on water and on energy, on environment and climate. And I'm curious, because there's not a lot on other issues. I'm curious, Mike, what do you make of this, and how do you bring this opportunity with the normalization to our topic? And Rafe, I'm going to ask you the same thing. I know we tend to agree, so try to disagree.
Well, I believe that the Abraham Accords offer a unique opportunity for a new type of regional cooperation on the environment. You correctly noted that there's a lot of emphasis on these issues in the annexes. These agreements are very different from the previous peace agreements Israel had with Jordan and Egypt, because there we're talking about countries sharing border with Israel, with a history of wars, of animosity, and essentially the peace agreements were more about non-belligerency than about anything else, and they remained cold peace. They were supposed to lead to warm peace, they remained cold peace. In this case, we're talking about countries with whom we do not share a common border, we don't have a history of war, and that's why the agenda is much more civilian. It is much more about these issues. This is a warm peace. It's peace between peoples, not only between governments, and it offers a lot of opportunities. It is much more complex when you talk about entities closer to Israel, entities with whom we do not have relations. There's still a lot of animosity towards Israel in this region. We don't have relations with many actors in this region. And when you talk about Palestinians, for example, as Race noted, everything is politicized. Only a small fraction of what we do is not politicized. So I think the way to go about it is, first we need some, to the extent that we can depoliticize, okay, but to the extent that we cannot, we need assistance from external actors. First, I believe that the Biden administration should play a role in this. We already see what I call the Biden effect. Suddenly, out of the blue, the Palestinians resume cooperation with Israel, take the tax revenue that we collect on their behalf, And if this new administration comes forward and say, this is our agenda, we want to advance cooperation on environment issues in the region, I think it could have an impact. I also believe that our new partners for peace in the region could also play a role in bridging the gap between us and countries with whom we do not have relations. And finally, I would note what Debbie said, that non-governmental initiatives, track 1.5, track 2, people to people, could also play a role here, and I would definitely emphasize them as well.
Thank you, Mike. Tessa, you mentioned some of these projects that you facilitate, and you ended with listing a few countries together, putting Lebanon in the list. And anyone who's ever followed, the Middle East knows that you can get Israelis and other people from other countries in the region, but Lebanon is always very sensitive, mostly from the Lebanese part. How are you going about this, and maybe this is, and more broadly, overcoming those political hurdles that everyone seemed to be agreeing that are not going away anytime soon?
Yeah, thanks, Shira, and again, thanks for the discussion. Technical issue. I really think this is a very, very rich discussion and quite open and frank. Yeah, obviously that's a difficulty. The project that I was mentioning for the entrepreneurs in sustainable food production does not include Israel. So it's a project run by a consortium of Lebanese, Egyptian, and two organizations from outside the region, and does not include Israel. So yeah, there's definitely a challenge there. I wanted to look at or just give an example of some of the ways that we see possibilities to work together, and they're not easy. That's a given. And if they were, we would be doing that. We wouldn't be talking about it. So that's pretty obvious. I just wanted to mention that there's the Commission for the Protection of the Danube River in Eastern Europe, which was established in 1994, and it includes 14 member countries. Now, if you look at the date of 1994, and you're looking at Eastern Europe, which is basically the Balkans, you know that this is a very impressive governance model, because this was established right after or even during the Balkan Wars that ripped the region apart. So these countries have come together because they realize that they all need this Danube River for different purposes, such as irrigation, transportation, tourism, and the more symbolic meaning of water for life. So it does carry the potential for a cooperation, even under very, very difficult circumstances. Now, if you look at something like a water-related comparison here in the region, you could think of the Nile Basin Initiative, which has been established in 2003 under the World Bank, including 11 riparian states. The Dutch have been involved via the World Bank from the beginning, and they're trying to come to a water sharing agreement of the Nile. Well, we all know how difficult that is with the Great Renaissance Dam being built now, but they're still talking to each other, and they still realize that they will have to come to some sort of agreement, because it's just simply too important to have it fail. Now, if you look at these type of governance structures, and I really liked some of the others talking about the pragmatics and the politics, and I was thinking about exactly the same while thinking about examples, marrying pragmatic with the principles. The principle of fair and equitable, reasonable sharing of water, and the do no harm principle, the historical rights or perceived historical rights, the agreements that are there, plus trying to enlarge the cake, so to speak, by looking at more functions or more use of resources than the first ones that come to mind.
Thank you. Sorry, I just want to give, we're running out of time and I want to give the other speakers a chance also to respond.
Yeah.
But, and thank you also, I really appreciate you bringing the issue of human rights and equitable sharing, which is not something we discuss a lot in this region, and we probably should.
Thank you.
Sorry, we just don't have enough time. Raith, I want to go back to you with the same question to Mike, I'm sorry. Abraham Accords were signed, the Palestinian Authority responded the way it responded, but taking a longer view, could these be helpful to maybe mediate on environmental issues between Israelis and Palestinians and for the region?
Before I answer this, maybe very quick point, I want to kind of amplify what Mike said and something that the other speakers was an undercurrent in their presentations. This is so valuable, this kind of interdisciplinary conversation where you bring people like Mike and myself from the more traditional security diplomatic with people who are more from the environmental or academic space, because we are all learning. I mean, like Mike, I blame Debbie for bringing me to Oxford, and I've always thought of these issues as tree huggers. And it forced me to start thinking in terms of how you integrate it within the national security framework that I operate within. So thank you for this. We need this both in the kind of collective, but also each country in its own to go through this own thinking. In terms of the Abraham Accords, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Shira. I agree with Mike. It is very promising. There is a lot of promise. I'm a bit more cynical or skeptical than Mike. Things have a way of not working in this region. I hope I'm wrong, but there is a lot of potential. Now, what we see today is that most of the energy is happening on the bilateral level. Israel with each of these countries, that makes perfect sense. These are the priorities. The challenge now is how do you take this from bilateral to a more regional? I doubt that this will happen out of an initiative from the region itself. I know some actors are interested. The Jordanians are pushing for it. The Egyptians are exploring. But this is not where the energy is happening. This is where we need some more external intervention. Here, I'm hopeful that this, maybe because I'm in Washington, I'm so American-centric, but I'm hoping that this is a priority that the new administration will focus on. They've been very clear that they're supporting these regional developments. The trick right now is how do you bring these regional developments and turn it from a bilateral or a number of bilateral tracks into a collective multilateral track. A big challenge here is the Palestinians. And for this, I think there is a special duty on some of the Arab countries, particularly Jordan and Egypt, but with support from Saudi and some of the others, to go to the Palestinians and say, look, this is bigger than you. What we're talking about here is in all of the region. We expect you, if you want us to support you, to come and engage in this. Because without Palestinian engagement, creating this multilateral becomes very difficult. So yes, I'm hopeful, but I think to turn it from bilateral to regional, you need an external player, and we need the Palestinians to come in. And for that, I think the Arabs have to step up and play their own role to ensure that they deliver that particular actor.
Well, thank you. It's maybe we shouldn't go back to it, but what Debbie started with, speaking about differentiating between John Kerry's previous role and today's role, but he does have a record and passion for this issue, and now he's going to bring this passion to a different issue and maybe marrying them both together in a role in a way that would be acceptable in the region could be some positive development. Khalid, I want to go back to you. In light of these normalization agreements between Israel and other countries in the region, and considering that Israel does have innovative capacity on food, on water, technologies, you mentioned yourself that Israel, using Israeli technology, Morocco has developed some of its agriculture in the 70s. Do you, and I know you're speaking as a private person not representing the Moroccan government, but do you think there's prospect for Israeli-Moroccan dialogue and cooperation on climate change?
Again, On the economic and human interaction, obviously the ties are very, historically very strong. I mean, you have to see that Morocco, for example, has made sure that its Jewish heritage would be taught in schools, public schools. The Jewish heritage has been enshrined also in our constitution. And so it's really about that human-to-human dimension between both Israel and Morocco. It's that the Israeli Jewish community that are considered Moroccans is really a pillar on what could improve the relationship between both countries. When it comes to cooperation on climate change and technologies, those are commercial technologies. They go through anyways, regardless of the political deadlock of the contacts between policy of both countries. And so perhaps building on that cultural heritage, I would think, there are non-commercial attribution where really Israeli technologies could help, but these are really non-commercial application where, these actors could join in land restoration, desert ecosystem adaptation, and perhaps also maintaining that cultural heritage preservation. I think is really what future generation must look into in trying to make sure that this asset is not lost through generations going ahead. This would be my take. The technology, commercially, it always sips through. You don't need politics to get involved.
Thank you for that. And last but not least, and we only have a minute, but Shad, I want to ask you, you are sitting in Qatar. Where do you have youth Arab counterparts, except for Qatar? I know Israel and Qatar, obviously, they don't have formal ties, but they do coordinate very closely, especially on Gaza. Do you see prospect for Israeli, Palestinian, Qatari collaboration? Can you have a counterpart, the Israeli youth climate movement, for example?
Well, I mean, not getting into politics, but from my own perspective and climate issues beyond politics now, like all the Gator expert from military was explaining, this is beyond the hands of many of the people who are thinking here. So beyond the regional issues, I think our region actually lack youth movement, unlike elsewhere in the world, even though some of the countries in the region are least contributing to global climate issues, but are the worst impact holding. So this also has to be seen as the global south. Our youth are far behind when the countries who are most polluting are forefront in the climate movement, which of course they need, but also we need to enhance our country's movement. So given the fact, I mean, relationship between the youth movement should be steady beyond the politics. That is what my take end of the day.
Thank you very much. We clearly, with such terrific experts, we need more time than 90 minutes for all of you, but I'm really happy we were able to bring you all in together, and we'll follow up with individual conversations on our podcast. I really want to thank you, Debbie, Mike, Tessa, Ray, Khalid, and Nishad for a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you, Alexander and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for your partnership and for being here. Thank you, Gal Sapir and Erez Fisher and Ezra Friedman here behind the scenes. Without them, nothing would happen. And thank you all for joining us. I look forward to future conversations. Stay healthy and well.